I want to thank Argus and Callisto Consulting, and in particular Ms. Jia on this opportunity to talk to you today in this UK-China Built Environment Road to Carbon Zero webinar series. I will talk to you about the topic why the world needs EPD, what an EPD is and how to get one or several ones, and how my organization, EPD International AB, can support you on your EPD journey. My name is Sebastiaan Stiller, and I am the CEO, or in Swedish, the verkställande direktör of EPD International AB. The International EPD system is the worldwide first EPD program founded in Sweden already in 1997. And in those days, it was really a joint effort between the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency, so here we're talking about a national authority, and industry, because industry was desperate in finding means and ways on how to communicate the environmental performance of their products and services in a trusted and credible way. So when the years went on and I would say standards were getting into place, there was a decision made in 2014 that the program shall have a new owner. So in 2014, EPD International AB was founded, and nowadays the company is a fully owned subsidiary to the not-for-profit organization IVL, Swedish Environmental Research Institute. Here, my company has a mission that we want to make quality EPD services as credible, accessible, and affordable as possible to all. That means that any organization, no matter its size, location, and industry, has the right to publish EPDs in a sensible, simple, and affordable way. As such, does EPD International today offer the registration and publication services for environmental product declarations in accordance with the most important standards. Think about the ISO 14025, the ISO 21930, and for Europe, the EN 1584 for construction products in particular. So, looking at this screen with a plethora of different kinds of EPDs from different kinds of product categories, now I'm asking you, and I'm asking myself the question, why do we need environmental product declarations, so-called EPD? I'm going to give to you two key reasons or drivers. And the first one is you want it because you need the numbers for example, a comparison, but also for decision making when you are trying to buy your next car or your next car fleet, and think about the spare parts. So you are starting to think not only in cost, in euros, but you also want to know more for decision making, in particular, what the environmental impact of this decision will be. And you're going to include more and more the entire life cycle of your products, because you don't only want to know what's the cost of capex, but also of maintenance, and last but not least, the effect on climate. This decision making is closely linked to the second driver, and the second driver is that we do see a clear trend that reporting carbon in the sense of your product performance is slowly moving from market regulation, which is by definition voluntary, into a legal sphere. So here we're talking legal compliance. And it's not only the stakeholders in the sense of the end consumer, it's actually also the industry and other stakeholders that are asking more and more. If you have a claim, if you say you're sustainable, I want to see proof. Therefore, show us your numbers. And you want to do this in a credible way. So when we know that society is acting as it is on climate change, and we do know that the topic is likely to gain in relevance, we also know that global environmental sustainability problems or challenges cannot or can never be solved without an active business sector. So industry is part of the solution, not only the cause. We also observe as a reaction to this that business is increasingly committing itself to various sustainability objectives and frameworks. They can be national, they can be supranational, but they can also be very, very, very in-house. So think about Science-Based Targets Framework, Carbon Disclosure Project, or the SRS reporting and the SASB reporting requirements. And then maybe a bit more currently more fluffy, still the net zero or carbon neutrality discussions going on. What do we really mean by that? Nevertheless, there are very strong embodied carbon demand drivers. And I would say these are the most prevailing ones. Think about, again, the SASB in the US, World Resource Institute, and again, Science-Based Targets Initiative. In other words, business simply needs to know the impact of their products and services. Because if you don't do your homework and you don't know the impact, you also cannot transparently communicate the impact of your products to your stakeholders. So you become vulnerable because they can say something which may not be the case, but you don't have to prove. So for that, you need comparable, objective, and third-party verified data to actually engage in such a dialogue. We also know that to enable this kind of dialogue, that the private sector itself is currently defining the level playing field by developing the standards they needed, for example, on environmental management systems, but also on conformity assessments and climate mitigation, as we have heard earlier. Besides these voluntary activities, as I mentioned, there's also a legal compliance field opening up. And here, the public sector is defining the level playing field for the so-called green economy. So here, the regulator wants to certain fair market competition, and by doing so, avoiding the risk for greenwashing. For an example, or for I've actually brought two examples to you today on the public sector activities, so compliance. One of them is the so-called European Eco-Design for Sustainable Product Regulation, so-called ESDR, in combination with, I would say, best practice for the construction sector, the so-called construction product regulation. But before I will explain in more detail, I need to state that at this stage, both the ESPR and the CPR that is currently under revision are proposals. So this is actually not hard law, but it gives you a glimpse in what is behind the horizon waiting for us in the future. Because there will be no discussion that it will come into place, but we simply don't know yet in the detail how and when and what exactly. Anyway, so earlier this year, the European Union presented its spring package as part of the European Green Deal. And this Green Deal is supposed to provide the necessary rules and tools to address the environmental challenges that the market is facing. This spring package is, I would say, really centered around activities ongoing in the so-called Eco-Design for Sustainable Product Regulation. And this regulation is the regulatory umbrella framework in case there is no specific legislation today existing that already addresses environmental sustainability issues in the market. And then when I talk about this market, of course, I talk about the European Union. So this is the umbrella. And the umbrella is a good indication, but we also see that we need more complementary regulation for specific industries. And in this case, I bring for you here the construction product regulation, which is this complementary regulation to implement ESPR, but then in particular in the construction sector for construction products. And this CPR provides a list of rules and requirements that shall be met in order to sell products in the EU in the future. And as that, the product is also assessed and verified against conformity with this CPR in order to obtain the so-called CE marking. So in French, the Conformité Européenne logo that you need in order to be active in the market. So this is clearly a market access issue. If you don't comply, you're not in the European market. As an example of a tool of the Spring package, I also want to point out the digital, and I'm stressing here, digital product passport, because the European Union is putting a lot of effort in digitizing the whole data flow. And this digital product passport will in the future contain the declaration of performance and the declaration of conformity, as well as instructions for use, reuse, and etc. And in the case of the CPR, it will also link all this information to so-called digital building logbooks. So what does that mean more concrete when we now look at the CPR? So when we know that the ESPR is the umbrella, again, we have other product legislation in place that can regulate sustainability of products. And in this case, again, the CPR. So the CPR itself contains rules on sustainability indicators that you shall make use of or not. So here, they make a distinction between core and additional indicators. On the right side of the screen, the core indicators are listed, whereof in blue, a very key indicator, which is called climate change or climate change effects, where it is split into four. So total, fossil, biogenic, and land use change. Why is this one important? Because in the proposal, it is proposed that you shall report this core indicator as part of the declaration of performance, which you need to get into the market because it's linked to the CE. Having said that, because it's a regulation, the European Commission wants, if the proposal gets through, that for all products in the market, this climate change effect, so CO2 equivalence, is reported as part of the CE mark. But then it's up to the member states to decide if, for example, also ozone depletion, acidification, and eutrophication shall be reported or not. The minimum requirement is climate change, but there will be cases differing on the member states that you have to report additional core and possibly also additional indicators. Good news, though, is, and this is also now bringing us in a minute or two to what is an EPD. An EPD as such reports these core indicators, so climate change, already as we speak today. So in that sense, if you do have an EPD, you are compliant with future CPR if this proposal comes through as we see it today. Another example, which already the relation is in place, is here in the Nordics, where there's a lot of effort going on to so-called decarbonize the construction sector in the Nordics. And I bring to you an example of Sweden, where from this year onwards, January, all new buildings that come to market require an LCA on a building level. And for that, you have to report your impact in a so-called climate declaration. To get to that climate declaration, the authority, so Boverket here in Sweden, provides a database that contains CO2 values for 171 generic construction materials and resources, which you can make use of if you don't have specific data on the products that you are using in your building. But be aware that these generic data sets are conservative values and have a 20% higher than typical value. What that means, actually, it gives you a very poor performance on your CO2. If you want to avoid that, you can make use of specific data, and therefore you need an EPD, and the EPD itself typically contains lower than the typical values, because, as we said, it is a conservative value. But if you use specific data, you have to show which EPD was used. So to make it very clear, you can make use of generic data, but if you want to have a good performance in the sense of an environmental performance, it is more or less, I would say, soft push to make use of EPDs, especially if we think about the fact that in the near future, so in a couple of countries you can see here, the so-called carbon footprint limits will or are already in place, which means that the regulator is pushing the bar lower and lower because they want to incentivize manufacturers to improve their products. Now, we know about the reasons why we need EPD, but what then is that EPD? In ISO talk, an EPD is a globally recognized communication format for so-called Type 3 environmental declarations. And there's the reference standard ISO 14025. So it is a declaration, so it's not an environmental label and it's not an environmental claim. It's also not a certificate that you just can buy off the shelf over. So in that sense, I want to point out that an EPD does not do any kind of benchmarking that you, for example, see in the labeling area, where it tells you that this product is red, green, or good, or better than another product. An EPD just carries and reports the actual results, and it does it in a scenario-free setup. To get to an EPD, you have to follow specific rules because LCA is very flexible, but to make LCA comparable, you have to follow the so-called product category rules, which we as EPD International develop. And as I said, this is really to make an LCA comparable because everybody is following exactly the same rules. Also important to know is that an LCA or the EPD is independently, that means third-party verified. And in order to call it an EPD, it is mandatory that it's registered with an EPD program operator, for example, with my system, International EPD system. So now you're wondering, okay, but that's all nice and good, and I like it, but how do I get there? So here you see the 4 steps you typically have to go through in order to get to the EPD, and it already tells you at first glimpse that this is not just a 1 or 2 week effort. This is a considerable project that you should plan for properly. Because first of all, you need a PCR. So you need a cookbook, the rules that you have to follow. Then you have to conduct a life cycle assessment that follows these rules. And here I would say the big challenge is for most companies to get to the data. So to get to the so-called bills of materials and the manufacturing data. So think about energy consumption, waste, water, etc. that is actually occurring in your manufacturing sites. Once that LCA has been conducted, it's transferred in a so-called EPD format because an EPD has 2 documents. It has a so-called background LCA report, which is for a verifier and contains very specific information so that the verification actually can take place. And then there's a so-called a public document, which is the actual EPD, and that EPD does not contain, I would say, business sensitive information. So information about your suppliers, where you do source your materials from, etc. That's really in the background report. So once it has been put into this new format, it goes into the verification step. And here we can work with independent verifiers or accredited verification bodies. I want to go into detail here, but this is to ascertain that the document is third-party independently verified. And once it's verified, then you can register it with the International EPD system for certification and registration. To conclude, an EPD is a tool. It's a document that communicates transparent, objective, and comparable information about the lifecycle environmental performance of your products and services. And I want to point out here that this EPD is always owned by you. So an EPD, International EPD system, is not becoming the owner of that information. We have a publishing right. Good. Now we know why and what, maybe also an offer from the International EPD system, how we can support you on that journey and what actually differentiates us from others in the market. Important to know is that the International EPD system is a true global player because we are, I would say, the only real EPD program with licensees on all continents except Antarctica that are representing our system, so our rules, everything that comes with it. You can see a couple of those. The latest launch was now Northern America, so Canada and US also joined us very recently. But we also have actors in Africa, in Asia, in Australasia, and Latin America. All there for you to help you to get started and publish EPDs in our system. We also have a pricing model that allows you to scale up EPD publication, because in our pricing model, the more EPDs you have to publish or you want to publish, the cheaper it gets per EPD. Another point, and that is a very indicative for the quality of the EPD that you have with the International EPD system, our product category rules, our cookbooks are considered best practice in the market as we speak. And we have, to my knowledge, the largest PCR library already available for you today. So you can come to us, and there's a high likeliness that we have the cookbook already for you available. We don't have to write it. Good to know also that we're one of the very few in the world that are accredited by the American National Standardization Institute for all product categories. So we don't only focus on construction. With us, you can have airplanes, you can have diapers, you can have anything. Another point that we also want to point out is that we're working hard on global harmonization, because we want to have one PCR for all, which means that we are working hard for you to minimize market trade barriers, because we don't want to have them in place. We don't want to have national players who play another game, because they should play the game in the same level playing field as we speak. We do this also to enable a fair comparison of results in the same product categories on a global scale. A good example of this is the Nordic Multilateral Recognition Agreement that we signed a couple of weeks ago. And this is the first one in the market, and is inspired by a new ISO standard of 429. Here, this international EPD system has partnered up with EPD Denmark and EPD Norway. And the idea is that we work towards this one PCR for all. Last but not least, we also plan, and we have the ambition to include additional EPD program operators. And here we want to go via the ECO platform. And the first prospect in line to join this new Nordic Mutual Recognition Agreement is Finland. Last but not least, I also want to point out that we do offer digital solutions, and that was also to the reference to the digital product passport from the European Commission, because we see that digital solutions will become an absolute necessity for you as manufacturers to provide many high quality EPDs in a timely manner at competitive cost. So my last slide, and also coming to an end, is giving you a quick glimpse of the digital highway that we're currently building for you. So you as a company can have on the left side an LCA consultant that you're hiring either in-house or externally to develop the so-called LCA with one of the most common software solutions, LCA software solutions like CIMA Pro, Sphera, OpenLCA, or tools that build on these kind of environments. All with the aim or the objective to enable you to work with LCA models in a more flexible way. Because before, 5-10 years ago, EPDs typically came with very complex Excel sheets. So here, the industry is doing a lot of effort in making LCA also more dynamic and flexible. Then we have the EPD portal. And in the EPD portal, we are the marketplace where you do register all the information from that LCA that has been conducted. Whereas then, once it has been verified, we also can push that information in different kinds of databases. And here, I want to point out quickly that we currently report your EPDs in the so-called IL3+EPD format, which is very common in Europe and other parts of the world. We're looking into the open EPD format that is very common in the US, and also a new standard for so-called environmental product declarations in building information modeling software, so BIM software. I'm not going to go into detail here. We're happy to inform you about the opportunities that you have. So moving as a manufacturer from single LCA in Excel to pre-verified or also other kinds of tools, building on LCA software, to where do I find information in the respective databases. But at the heart is the EPD portal that I warmly invite you also to sign up to if you're interested in developing EPDs, because you will find a lot of information on our website, and it's for free. Having said that, I also want to trigger the discussion with you now in the Q&A. So I'm looking very much forward to your questions. And in case you have already issues or you want to talk about it, I also provided contact details. So you can contact us on support@environment.com or info@environment.com. And we also have a dedicated China office. And here my colleague Xu Ming is willing to take your questions and have to start the dialogue bilaterally.